The sky above was thick with smoke, the air heavy with the scent of burning metal and scorched earth. Lieutenant Adam trudged through the ashen remains of a once thriving city, now nothing more than a crumbled memory. His boots crushed the brittle ground beneath him, the only sound in the eerie silence punctuated by the distant rumble of explosions. The buildings that remained were gutted skeletons, their walls blackened and broken. Monuments that had stood for centuries lay shattered, their pride reduced to rubble. This was the planet Zithro, a once flourishing world that had been ravaged by a brutal war. Adam's mission was simple but grim: evacuate any survivors, help those they could, and pull out before the enemy forces returned to finish what they'd started. His unit, scattered and exhausted, moved cautiously through the ruins, eyes sharp for any signs of life or danger. The war had been merciless. Entire civilizations wiped out, and Zithro was one of the many worlds caught in the crossfire. The coalition of alien races had betrayed their own, aligning with a ruthless force that sought only power and destruction. Peace was no longer an option. Survival was all that was left. A sudden explosion shook the ground beneath Adam's feet. The enemy was near, remnants of the hostile forces still lingering, unwilling to let go of their stranglehold. His unit tensed, weapons raised. They moved swiftly through the shattered city, trying to make it to the extraction point, but the ambush came quicker than they anticipated. Blaster fire erupted from the shadows of the buildings, energy beams lighting up the dim, smoke-filled streets. Adam's team returned fire, taking cover where they could, but it was clear they were outnumbered. His men were brave but weary. Some had been fighting for days without rest, their numbers dwindling with every encounter. Through the chaos, Adam's gaze caught a flicker of movement, something out of place in the destruction. Among the debris, a figure darted between the broken structures, small, quick, and clearly not part of the enemy. His instincts took over, and without hesitation, he broke from cover and sprinted toward the movement. Blaster fire whizzed past him, but he didn't stop. The figure was an alien woman, her pale skin smeared with dirt, her eyes wide with terror. She was running for her life, chased by enemy forces that had singled her out. Adam could see the desperation in her every step. He knew he had only moments to act. With a burst of speed, he closed the gap between them and tackled her to the ground just as a barrage of blaster fire shredded the air where she had been moments before. They tumbled into the cover of a collapsed building, breathless and shaken, but alive. The woman stared at him, wide-eyed, her chest heaving as she tried to process what had just happened. Adam, catching his breath, glanced over the edge of the rubble. The enemy was still closing in, and they didn't have much time. "Stay low," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sounds of battle. He raised his weapon and fired a few shots to keep the enemy at bay, buying them precious seconds. The woman clutched at the remains of her clothing, eyes darting between Adam and the enemy forces. She was clearly terrified, but there was something more. It wasn't just fear of death. There was a depth to her gaze that Adam couldn't quite place, something broken yet resolute. "Who are you?" she finally whispered, her voice shaky. "Lieutenant Adam," he replied, glancing back at her. "And you?" "Kiara," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. The name meant nothing to him, but the vulnerability in her eyes struck something deep within him. She wasn't just another survivor. There was something about her, something that made him feel like he had to protect her, even if he couldn't fully explain why. "We need to move," Adam said, pulling her to her feet. "It's not safe here." She hesitated, glancing back toward the direction she had been running from, but nodded. Together, they slipped through the ruins, Adam leading the way as the sounds of battle faded behind them. His unit was still out there, fighting valiantly, but he couldn't leave her behind. Something about her compelled him to keep her safe. As they made their way through the twisted remains of the city, Adam's mind raced. Kira wasn't like the other survivors he'd encountered. She moved with a grace that spoke of someone used to authority, yet her demeanor was shattered, as if she had seen too much in too little time. There was a fragility to her that tugged at his sense of duty. They ducked into an abandoned building, the walls offering them a momentary reprieve from the dangers outside. Kira collapsed onto the floor, trembling from exhaustion. Adam stood guard by the window, scanning the streets for any sign of the enemy. "They're still looking for me," Kira whispered, her voice heavy with dread. "They won't stop." "Who?" Adam asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew the answer. "The Coalition," she replied. "The ones who betrayed my people." Adam's jaw tightened. He had heard stories of the Coalition's betrayal, how they had sold out entire worlds to save their own skins, how they had aligned themselves with the very forces that had brought destruction to Zithro. It was a betrayal that had cost millions of lives. "Why are they after you?" Adam asked, his gaze never leaving the streets outside. I was part of the resistance," Kira said, her voice cracking. "We fought against them, tried to stop them from destroying everything. But we failed. They want me dead because I know too much." Adam's heart pounded in his chest. He had rescued a target. The Coalition wouldn't stop until they had silenced her. But looking at Kira, he couldn't help but feel a surge of protectiveness. She was more than just a target to him now. She was someone he had to save. The sound of footsteps outside jolted them both. Adam raised his weapon, ready to defend them if necessary. But the footsteps faded, and the tension slowly ebbed away. He turned back to Kira. "We'll get you out of here," he said firmly. "I promise." Kira looked at him with a mixture of fear and hope. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Adam didn't have a clear answer. All he knew was that something inside him wouldn't let him leave her behind. There was a bond forming between them, unspoken but undeniable. It was a connection that went beyond species, beyond the horrors of war. And in that moment, Adam made a silent vow to protect her, no matter the cost. The desolation stretched out for miles, an endless sea of jagged rock and lifeless dirt. Adam and Kira pressed on, their every step a struggle against the unforgiving terrain. The sky above was an angry swirl of dark clouds, threatening storms that could kill them just as easily as the enemy hunting them. They were far from safe, but there was no choice but to keep moving. The sound of distant gunfire echoed occasionally, a reminder that the battle wasn't over, just temporarily out of sight. Every now and then, Adam scanned the horizon, his instincts honed by years of combat. He knew they were being tracked, and it was only a matter of time before the enemy caught up. Kira stumbled, her legs buckling from exhaustion, but Adam caught her before she hit the ground. She was running on fumes, but there was no time for rest. They had been moving for hours, dodging patrols, hiding from drones, and navigating the treacherous wasteland. Adam felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Kira was fragile, vulnerable, and it was up to him to get her to safety. "We're almost there," he lied, his voice steady. He didn't know where there was, but Kira needed hope. Hope was the only thing keeping her moving. She nodded weakly, too tired to speak. They resumed their slow, painful march, with the oppressive silence around them only broken by the howling wind. Adam knew that the wasteland would kill them if the enemy didn't find them first. The environment itself was their enemy. Razor-sharp rocks shredded their boots, and the dust-filled air scraped their throats raw. Still, they pushed forward. After what felt like an eternity, they found a small ridge offering a brief respite from the biting wind. Adam dropped to one knee, scanning the horizon again for any sign of movement. His senses were on high alert, but all he saw was more of the same barren landscape. For the moment, they were alone. Kira slumped down next to him, her chest rising and falling heavily as she tried to catch her breath. She was silent for a while, staring out into the nothingness, her thoughts distant. Adam could sense the weight she carried, something more than just exhaustion. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "It wasn't always like this," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Zithro was beautiful once." Adam glanced at her. He could tell this wasn't just about the planet's destruction. There was more to her story. He waited, letting her speak when she was ready. "My people, we were peaceful," Kira continued, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "We never wanted war. But the Coalition, they betrayed us. They sold us out to the invaders for their own survival. Her voice wavered, but she kept going, the words tumbling out like a confession. We trusted them. We thought they would stand with us, but they didn't. They handed us over, and in return, they were spared. The invasion, it was over before we even had a chance to fight back. Adam listened in silence, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He had heard stories of betrayal before, but hearing it from someone who had lived through it made it real in a way he hadn't expected. The pain in her voice was raw, a wound that would never fully heal. I was part of the resistance, she continued, her voice hardening. We fought back, but it was too late. Most of my people were already gone. Those who survived, they're being hunted now, like me. There's nothing left. Adam clenched his fists. He could see the pain in her eyes, the bitterness of having her world torn apart by those she once trusted. It was a story he had heard too many times in the aftermath of this war, but hearing it from her made it personal. He had already decided that he would protect her, but now he felt something deeper, a fierce resolve to make sure she got out alive. You're safe with me, Adam said, his voice firm. I won't let them take you. Kira looked at him, her expression softening for the first time. There was a moment of vulnerability in her eyes, a brief glimpse of trust. She nodded, but Adam could see the doubt lingering beneath the surface. She had lost everything, and it would take more than words to convince her that things could ever be okay again. They sat in silence for a few moments longer before Adam motioned for them to move again. The journey was far from over, and they couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. As they continued through the wasteland, Adam found himself thinking about Kira's story. The coalition had betrayed her people, and now she was on the run, hunted by the very forces she once fought against. It made sense why she was so guarded, so broken. But there were small things that didn't quite add up. Little inconsistencies in her story. Adam brushed them aside, telling himself it was just the trauma of war, the strain of survival. People remembered things differently under stress. But still, the doubts lingered at the back of his mind, subtle but persistent. As they pressed on, the sky darkened, and the winds grew stronger. They found themselves in the middle of a violent storm, the kind that could tear flesh from bone if they weren't careful. They huddled together under the meager shelter of a rock formation, the wind howling around them like a living thing. Adam kept his arms around Kira, shielding her from the worst of the storm. She trembled in his embrace, but whether from the cold or something deeper, he couldn't tell. When the storm finally passed, they were soaked, exhausted, and still no closer to safety. Adam felt the weight of fatigue pulling at him, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Kira broke the silence again, her voice barely above a whisper. I failed them, she said, her words heavy with regret. I couldn't save anyone. Adam looked at her, surprised by the raw emotion in her voice. She had been so composed, so guarded. This was the first time he had seen her truly vulnerable. You did everything you could, Adam replied, his tone soft but firm. It wasn't your fault. Kira shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I should have done more. I should have seen the betrayal coming. I was supposed to protect them, and I failed. Adam's heart ached at the sight of her breaking down. He wanted to comfort her, to tell her that it wasn't her responsibility, but he knew that nothing he said could take away the pain she felt. All he could do was be there, to stand by her, even when the world seemed determined to tear them apart. In that moment, something shifted between them. The bond they shared deepened, not out of necessity, but out of understanding. They were both survivors, both carrying the weight of worlds they couldn't save. And in that shared pain, they found a sliver of solace. But as much as Adam wanted to believe Kira's story, the doubts still lingered. There was something she wasn't telling him, something she was keeping hidden. He could feel it, like a shadow hanging over them. But for now, he pushed those thoughts aside. There would be time for questions later. Right now, all that mattered was getting her to safety. And for the first time, Adam felt a growing sense of responsibility, not just as a soldier, but as someone who cared for Kira. Whether it was his duty or something more, he couldn't yet define. But he knew he couldn't let her face this world alone. The path ahead was narrow, surrounded by jagged cliffs and scattered debris. Every step Adam and Kira took brought them closer to safety, but it also increased the danger. The enemy was relentless, and Adam knew they were being tracked. He could feel it. His instincts, sharpened by years of combat, were screaming at him to stay alert. Kira walked silently beside him, her expression calm despite everything they had been through. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of blaster fire echoed through the ravine. Adam reacted immediately, pulling Kira down into cover behind a large boulder. Energy blasts scorched the ground where they had been standing moments before, the air filled with the sharp hiss of enemy fire. "They found us," Adam muttered under his breath. His mind raced as he quickly assessed the situation. The enemy force was larger than expected, at least a dozen soldiers, heavily armed, closing in fast. There was no way out but through. His heart pounded, but his mind stayed sharp. They had to fight. Kira was already moving, her eyes scanning the battlefield with a focus that surprised Adam. She reached for a discarded weapon on the ground, and in one fluid motion, she was ready to fight back. Adam caught a glimpse of her expression, calm, almost too calm. There was something about the way she handled herself in the face of overwhelming odds that made him pause for a second, but there was no time to think. The enemy was advancing. "Stay close to me," Adam ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos. He peeked out from behind the boulder, then opened fire, taking down two enemies with precise shots. Kira was right behind him, firing her weapon with unerring accuracy. She moved like a trained soldier, her actions calculated and swift. For a moment, Adam was caught off guard. Kira had claimed to be part of the resistance, but the way she fought suggested far more experience than she had let on. He pushed the thought to the back of his mind as the fight raged on. There was no time for doubt, not now. They moved in sync, ducking behind cover, returning fire, and slowly pushing the enemy back. But it wasn't enough. More soldiers appeared, pinning them down. Adam could feel the pressure building. His body ached from exhaustion, but his resolve remained firm. He had promised to protect Kira, and he wasn't about to break that promise. As the fight intensified, Adam took a hit. The pain shot through his side, a sharp, searing sensation that nearly brought him to his knees. He gritted his teeth and kept moving, firing back with everything he had. Kira was at his side in an instant, her face unreadable. "You're hurt," she said, but there was no panic in her voice. Adam looked at her, and for a brief moment, he felt a flicker of unease. She was too composed, too collected in the middle of this chaos. Something wasn't right. "I'm fine," Adam replied, even though the pain was nearly unbearable. He couldn't afford to be weak, not now. They were outnumbered, and the enemy wasn't letting up. Kira's quick thinking saved them more than once. She spotted weak points in the enemy's formation, pointing them out to Adam, who used them to gain the upper hand. Her knowledge of enemy tactics was impressive, almost as if she knew exactly what they were going to do before they did it. Adam couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than she had revealed. As the fight dragged on, the enemy began to retreat. They had taken heavy losses, and Adam's relentless assault had forced them back. But it wasn't a victory, merely a brief respite. Adam slumped against a rock, breathing heavily, blood soaking his side. The wound was worse than he had let on, but he couldn't stop now. He had to keep going. Kira crouched beside him, inspecting the wound with the same calm expression she had worn throughout the battle. "You need medical attention," she said, her voice still level. Adam shook his head. "We're not safe yet. We have to keep moving." Kira didn't argue, but there was a strange intensity in her gaze that made Adam's stomach twist. She was too calm, too detached. He wanted to ask her how she had managed to stay so composed during the fight, how she seemed to know the enemy's tactics so well, but he didn't. He didn't want to doubt her, not after everything they had been through. They reached a small cave at the base of a cliff, a temporary safe zone where they could regroup. Adam sat down heavily, his body protesting every movement. Kira sat beside him, her eyes scanning the horizon, always alert, always calculating. For the first time, Adam let himself question the things he had ignored. Kira had been unusually calm under fire. She had known how to fight, how to lead them through the ambush, and how to spot enemy weaknesses. None of that fit with the story she had told him. He wanted to ask her about it, to demand answers, but the words caught in his throat. He was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, and his loyalty to her still held him back. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to push the doubts away. Kira had been through so much, betrayed by her own people, hunted by the enemy. She had trusted him to protect her, and he had made a promise to keep her safe. But the inconsistencies in her story gnawed at him, and the growing unease in his chest was impossible to ignore. Kira shifted beside him, her gaze still fixed on the entrance to the cave. She hadn't said much since the battle ended, and Adam couldn't help but wonder what was going through her mind. She had seemed so vulnerable when she told him about the betrayal of her people, but now she seemed like someone else entirely. Strong. Unbreakable. Calculating. Adam opened his eyes, the doubts swirling in his mind. He had fought for her, bled for her, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't know her at all. He had trusted her story, trusted her intentions. But was that trust misplaced? The silence between them stretched on, heavy with unspoken questions. Adam knew he couldn't afford to doubt her, not yet. They were still in danger, still hunted. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't make it go away. He glanced at Kira, who sat unmoving beside him, her expression unreadable. The bond they had formed was still there, but it was fraying at the edges. And Adam knew that sooner or later he would have to confront the truth, whatever it was. The tension in the cave was palpable. They had been waiting for extraction for hours, the silence thick between them. Adam's mind was racing, replaying the events of the last few days over and over. Something about Kira didn't sit right. The way she moved in battle, how she knew the enemy's tactics, her unnerving calm, it all gnawed at him. He wanted to believe her, but doubt had rooted itself too deep. As Adam sat in silence, his eyes half closed, he heard something faint. It wasn't the wind or the distant echoes of war. It was Kira, speaking softly, almost too softly to hear. His instincts flared. He strained to listen, his pulse quickening. The voice on the other end of the communication was deep, guttural, alien. It was a language Adam didn't fully understand, but he caught enough to know it was not a friendly conversation. Kira's tone was cold, calculated, nothing like the vulnerable woman she had presented herself as. Her words were clipped, precise. This wasn't the voice of someone pleading for help. It was the voice of someone giving orders. Adam felt a chill run through him as the realization began to sink in. She wasn't who she claimed to be. Adam's heart pounded in his chest. He felt a wave of betrayal wash over him, but he forced himself to stay still, to listen. The conversation ended as abruptly as it had started, and Kira turned back toward him, unaware that he had heard. She sat, her face neutral, giving nothing away. But Adam knew. He couldn't ignore it any longer. The doubts he had been pushing aside, the inconsistencies in her story, everything suddenly clicked into place. He felt sick. He had fought for her, protected her, believed in her, and it had all been a lie. His jaw clenched as the anger rose inside him. He needed answers. "Kira," he said, his voice low but hard. "Who are you talking to?" Her head snapped toward him, eyes narrowing just slightly, but enough for him to notice. For a moment, she didn't speak, weighing her options. Adam's hand was already on his weapon, but it wasn't out of fear. It was because he needed to be prepared for whatever came next. "You heard that?" she asked, her tone still calm, but there was something new in her voice now, something colder. "I heard enough," Adam replied, his eyes locked on hers. "Tell me the truth. Who are you really?" Kira hesitated, her expression unreadable. But Adam could see it now, the mask she had worn was slipping. The vulnerability, the fear, the helplessness, It had all been an act. She wasn't a victim. She was something else entirely. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, with a slow, almost deliberate movement, she stood up, her eyes never leaving Adam's. There was no more pretense, no more hiding behind a false story. "You want the truth?" she said, her voice low but laced with something darker. "Fine. I'll give it to you." Adam's body tensed, his mind racing, but he didn't move. He needed to hear this. He needed to know what kind of monster he had been protecting. "I wasn't just part of the resistance," Kira said, her voice steady and devoid of any emotion now. "I led it. But that's not the part that matters." She took a step closer, her eyes cold and sharp. "The coalition didn't betray us. I did." Adam's heart stopped. He stared at her, the weight of her words crashing down on him. Betrayal. It wasn't the coalition that had turned against her people. It was her. "I made a deal with a more powerful race," she continued, her tone matter-of-fact. "In exchange for my survival, I gave them everything, my people, my planet, everything. They promised me power, immortality. All I had to do was sacrifice a few million lives." Adam's stomach turned. His mind reeled as the full extent of her treachery became clear. The destruction of her world, the deaths of her people, it had all been her doing. And he had fought for her, believed her lies. "You used me," Adam said, his voice barely above a whisper, but laced with fury. "You used all of us." Kira didn't flinch. "I did what I had to do to survive," she said simply, as if it were the most logical thing in the world. "You're not the first soldier I've manipulated, and you won't be the last." Adam's hands clenched into fists, every muscle in his body coiled with anger. He had been fighting to protect her, risking everything for what he thought was a noble cause. But it had all been for nothing. She had used him as a pawn in her game, nothing more. "What was the plan?" Adam asked, his voice sharp. "Use me to escape? Rebuild your power? Continue this madness?" Kira's expression remained impassive. "Something like that," she said. "You have military connections. You're a hero in your world. It would have been easy to use you to gain access to more resources, rebuild what I lost. And then, well, I'm sure you can imagine the rest." Adam's vision blurred with rage. Everything he had fought for, everything he had believed in, it was all a lie. He had been manipulated, tricked into helping a monster. "You don't have to do this," Adam said, his voice thick with emotion. "We can still stop them. You don't have to keep playing their game." For the first time, Kira's expression shifted, just slightly. A flicker of something, almost like regret, passed through her eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it had come. "It's too late for that," she said, her voice softer now. "I made my choice." Adam stared at her, the woman he thought he knew now a stranger. His heart ached with betrayal, his mind torn between his duty and his emotions. He had promised to protect her, but now he didn't even know who he had made that promise to. The silence between them was heavy, the weight of the truth settling in. Adam felt a deep sense of loss, not just for the people who had died because of Kira's actions, but for the bond he had believed was real. He had trusted her, fought for her, and now he didn't know what to believe. "I trusted you," Adam said, his voice breaking with the weight of it all. "And you used me." Kira's gaze softened, just for a moment. "I never asked you to trust me," she replied quietly. "That was your choice." Adam's chest tightened with anger, grief, and the overwhelming sense that everything he had done had been for nothing. His honor, his loyalty, it had been twisted into something ugly, something he couldn't reconcile. As the reality of the situation settled in, Adam knew that the hardest decision of his life lay ahead. The low hum of the extraction ship echoed through the cave, signaling that their time had run out. Adam stood at the edge of the cave entrance, his mind a swirling storm of conflicting emotions. The cold truth of Kira's betrayal sat heavy in his chest, weighing down every thought. His body ached from the battle, his wounds still fresh, but the real pain came from the decision he now had to make. It wasn't a simple matter of survival anymore. It was about choosing between what was right and what was easy. Kira moved behind him, her presence a constant reminder of everything that had unraveled. He didn't turn to look at her, his gaze fixed on the extraction ship descending from the sky. This was the moment that would define everything. He could feel it in his bones. "You're still going to save me, aren't you?" Kira's voice was soft, almost soothing, but Adam could hear the underlying manipulation. It was the same tone she had used when she first spun her web of lies, the tone that had made him believe she was something she wasn't. Adam clenched his fists, the anger bubbling up again. He wanted to yell, to scream at her for what she had done, but that wouldn't change anything. His emotions wouldn't solve the problem in front of him. He had to think clearly, had to decide whether to let her escape or stop her for good. Kira stepped closer, her hand brushing against his arm in a gesture that might have been comforting if not for the weight of the truth between them. "I know you're angry," she said softly, "but we don't have to be enemies. You've seen what I'm capable of, Adam. I can help you. With the power I have, we could bring peace to the galaxy. Together." Adam shook his head, still staring at the approaching ship. "Peace?" he muttered. "That's what you call it? Sacrificing your own people for power?" "They were a small price to pay," Kira said, her voice taking on a more calculated edge. "You don't understand the bigger picture. The galaxy is on the brink of collapse. I didn't betray my people. I ensured that I survived to help shape what's to come. Without me, there's only chaos." Adam turned to face her now, his eyes filled with the conflict he had been wrestling with since the moment he learned the truth. "And what about the millions who died? The people you handed over to their deaths? Were they part of your vision for peace too?" Kira's gaze hardened, but she kept her voice calm. "Sacrifices have to be made. You of all people should understand that, Adam. You've fought in wars, you've seen what it takes to win. What I did was no different." "It's not the same," Adam said, his voice rising. "I fought to protect people. You fought for yourself." Kira's face tightened, her patience thinning. "I did what I had to do," she said, her tone sharpening. "And now I'm offering you a chance to be part of something bigger. You can either help me or..." Adam took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. She wasn't going to stop. No matter what she said, no matter how she framed it, Kira's ambition was too dangerous. If he let her go now, she would rebuild, just as she had planned all along. And the destruction she would cause next time would be even worse. "You think you're saving the galaxy," Adam said, his voice steady but laced with anger. "But all you're doing is making sure no one else stands in your way. You don't want peace, you want control." Kira's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Adam," she said, her voice low. "You've already invested too much in me to turn back now." He stared at her for a long moment, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a physical force. The bond they had shared, however brief, had been real to him. He had fought for her, bled for her, believed in her cause. And now he had to let it all go. His hand drifted toward his weapon, his resolve hardening. "I can't let you leave," he said quietly. "Not after everything you've done." Kira's expression shifted, her calm demeanor breaking for the first time. "You don't have to do this," she said quickly, taking a step forward. "We can still work together. Think about it, everything we could accomplish. You said you wanted to help people. This is your chance." But Adam saw through her now. Every word was another attempt to manipulate him, to make him doubt himself, to make him forget the lives that had been lost because of her. He couldn't let it happen again. "I made a promise," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "To protect you. But now I see that means protecting the galaxy from you." Kira's eyes widened as she realized what was about to happen. In a flash, she lunged at him, her hand reaching for a concealed blade. But Adam was ready. He sidestepped her attack, grabbing her arm and twisting it behind her back. She struggled, her strength surprising but not enough to overpower him. "You can't stop me," she hissed, her voice venomous now. "Even if you hand me over, I'll find a way out." "I always do." Adam tightened his grip, the pain of his wound flaring up but not enough to stop him. He didn't say anything, just forced her to the ground, disarming her in the process. Her desperation was palpable now, her calm mask completely shattered. With one hand holding her down, Adam activated his comms with the other. "This is Lieutenant Adam," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos inside him. "I have a prisoner. She's dangerous. You'll want to take extra precautions." There was a pause on the other end, but then the voice of his commander came through, acknowledging the message. Kira struggled beneath him, her fury evident. "You're making a mistake, Adam," she spat. "You'll regret this. I could have given you everything." But Adam didn't flinch. The decision was made. His loyalty, his duty, his sense of honor, they all pointed to the same conclusion. Kira had to be stopped, no matter the cost. As the extraction ship landed, Adam hauled her to her feet, keeping a firm grip on her arm. He could feel the weight of the moment, the realization that everything he had fought for had come down to this. The bond they had formed was shattered, but his resolve remained intact. Kira's eyes burned with hatred, but Adam didn't let it shake him. He had made his choice, and it was the right one, no matter how much it hurt. The ship doors opened, and soldiers stepped out to take Kira into custody. Adam handed her over without a word, watching as they secured her in restraints and led her inside. She glared at him one last time, her mouth twisted into a snarl. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "I promise you that." Adam didn't respond. He just watched as the doors closed, sealing her fate. The weight of what had happened pressed down on him, but he stood tall, knowing he had done the only thing he could. As the ship lifted off, Adam stood alone in the silence, the lessons of war and betrayal heavy on his heart. He had lost something that day, not just his trust in Kira, but his faith in the easy victories he had once believed in. But despite it all, he remained committed to doing what was right, no matter how difficult the path. And in that he found a quiet sense of resolve.